Parliamentary updates.
Participants of the first cohort of the Young Women Empowered to Serve leadership program saw the culmination of their efforts in the form of a parliamentary sitting. The women were asked to debate on a private motion which called on the government to introduce legislation within 12 months to make sextortion a criminal offence. The mover of the motion was Leader of the Opposition and MP for Siparia, Ms. Renee Atwell.
Madam Speaker, sextortion is an everyday reality for women and girls in Trinidad and Tobago. This has led to a cultural normalization where there is sexual exploitation and abuse of power under this government because they have failed to put measures in place to protect the women and girls of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam Speaker, I wish to ask the government this question through you. How many more? Because we are wondering how many more women and girls must endure humiliation and trauma before they decide to implement urgent legislation to deal with the issue of sextortion.
Referring to the UN statistics, MP Atwell went on to explain why the law is needed.
And I know the government might come to say, well, we have existing legislation to deal with this. But the uniqueness of sextortion, Madam Speaker, encompassing these two components is what calls for a unique kind of legislation. Because you see, the two components, the sexual component and the corruption component, are usually prosecuted under two different types of legislation. You have your Sexual Offences Act and you have your Proceeds of Corruption Act or your Prevention of Corruption Act. But sextortion combines these two elements, and that is essentially why we are calling on the government to implement a unique kind of legislation, a standalone legislation, to deal with this issue.
The merit of bringing this bill is due, of course, to the frequency in which sextortion incidents happen in Trinidad and Tobago. It's something that is largely unreported, of course, due to the taboo associated with it. But the statistics are quite clear that it is something that happens frequently. And so, of course, in an effort to achieve gender equality and sustainable development, it is important to have legislative protection for incidents of sextortion. And I think that is the main reason for introducing, or of course, the opposition asking the government to introduce legislation to criminalize sextortion.
Kicking off the debate was the Attorney General and MP for San Fernando West, Ms. Andisa West.
And it is on this note that the government welcomes the need to name, shame, and end sextortion in Trinidad and Tobago. So much so, Madam Speaker, that the Leader of the House has informed all members on this side that she will be lifting her whip in relation to this motion, because this government recognizes that an issue as important as sextortion should not be reduced to mere party politics or a bid to score cheap political points, but rather all members on this side will be voting for this motion in line with their conscience. Might I remind the opposition that it is this government who implemented the Domestic Violence Amendment Act, the first of its kind in the Commonwealth Caribbean, and which added additional protection for victims of domestic violence. And we also introduced the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill, which seeks to deal with issues such as voyeurism and revenge porn in Trinidad and Tobago.
She listed some of the specific demographics that will be analyzed to craft strong and inclusive law.
We recognize that certain sectors of our society, because of their socio-economic vulnerabilities and the intersections at play, make them an easy target to sextortion. This includes, for instance, the socio-economically vulnerable woman in the constituency of Miaro or the constituency of Muruga Tableland, the undocumented immigrant woman, or even a child under the age of 18 or a university student who is forced to conduct sexual acts in order to pass their course or receive a good grade. However, Transparency International noted that while women are disproportionately affected by sextortion, it also affects gender non-conforming individuals, transgender individuals, children, and men. Therefore, we recognize the need to treat the issue of sextortion with the utmost care and attention.
And so, to be quite honest, during the process is where I learned a lot about sextortion. So it definitely widened my thinking in relation to that, particularly realizing how little our laws has done to address the issue of sextortion. So for instance, the Integrity in Public Life Act only applies to public officials and doesn't necessarily apply to private officials. So me as an attorney was able to learn a lot about sextortion, and hopefully they legislate on the issue and create bespoke legislation so that it would be able to affect the persons who are currently being affected by sextortion, it should definitely have more cohorts. So for instance, I'm from Rio Claro, and the ability to interact with the various parliamentarians and receive one-on-one sessions with them was definitely a benefit to me, which a lot of persons from Rio Claro may not be able to have access to. So I think that the program should continue so that more young women would be able to have access to programs like these.
The member for St. Augustine also contributed during the debate, citing a real-life scenario.
As a member for St. Augustine, let me bring this home to my constituency. At the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, March 2021, allegations of sexual harassment and assault by a staff member were brought to the public awareness by his students. Madam Speaker, this lecturer was using the campus as well as his office to take nude photographs of his students. Is this not a clear case of sextortion?
She knocked the government for their pushback on the bill.
I would like to ask why the government cannot multitask. They seem to think that they can only educate the public and then create the legislation. We cannot do this simultaneously, Madam Speaker. We, the opposition, is advocating for clear legislation. Madam Speaker, we do not want persons to feel that they can take advantage of the gaps within our system and slip through so that these instances do not go reported, Madam Speaker.
The experience of being in the Parliament was quite nerve-wracking because I've never done something like this before. While yes, I do speak publicly and things like that, having to contribute in the chambers is a quite different experience. And the legislation, the motion to introduce legislation on sextortion, I do think it's important because in preparation for this debate, we'd have done a lot of research, and the things that we would have found would have been alarming. And I would have been the Shadow Minister for Education, and to see the amount of issues in our education system, I think that this legislation is important and they should consider implementing it within Trinidad and Tobago. I think that it would be a shame if they don't continue it because a lot of things that I learned here I wasn't familiar with. And I think we take it for granted that persons may be aware of things like legislations and how things are introduced in the Parliament. I did not know anything with regard to the opposition has to bring a motion, it's not considered a bill and things like that. I did not know any of those things before participating in this program. So to think that they would not continue, it would be a shame for persons who would like to get into this, and they would see that we would have done it and they'd be like, oh yes, this is something I would like to do, and then it's no longer available. No, it should definitely continue.
The Leader of the House spoke in her capacity as the Minister of Housing and Urban Development.
Madam Speaker, 6 years ago, speaking in a webinar entitled Sextortion, Land and Governance, it was stated by Ms. Marwa Fatafta, Regional Advisor for Transparency International, that, and I quote, "Sextortion plays on the desperation of the victim." She later stated that one way to combat such is to increase access to services across the board. Madam Speaker, that is what this government has done.
The minister went on to explain another initiative with UDICOT.
But I must state that in the face of sextortion, I agree, cannot be business as usual, and it would not be, especially in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. We have been taken in front, Madam Speaker, before in front take us. And my team has sat with the folks at the Urban Development Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, familiarly known as UDICOT, to establish a quota of female subcontractors that would be taken on. Madam Speaker, this is forecasted to improve and remove the notion that women will continue to be underrepresented under this government.
Today has been a whirlwind. It's been a great experience, but even before we came here today, I took this role so seriously. We had 5 caucuses and the girls were tired of me, but we left it all out on the floor today and they were necessary. It shows that it was necessary. I think the motion was a really critical motion. When you get into the research, you understand the veracity of it and the entirety of it, that this is actually a serious issue that the actual government needs to take seriously.
And the Chief Whip and member for Pointe-a-Pierre, Ms. Leah Bristol, in her contribution, lamented the lack of data on this urgent issue from the Central Statistical Office.
The only document that may have been of some relevance was a survey by Cecil Pemberton and Joel Joseph titled the National Women's Health Survey 2017. That is correct, 2017. It would have been 7 years since the CSO has last provided us with data specifically on matters of this nature. And I listened to them. If the government says that they have all these great plans on addressing sextortion, where's the data? I question how the government, which has evidently made no effort to update or disseminate the relevant data, can confidently assert that their efforts are enough. How do they know which industries are affected the most? How do they know which communities are affected the most? How do they know which age groups are affected the most? Or are they governing based on guesswork and outdated information?
She questioned if the government remembered its obligations to international treaties.
As the Shadow Minister for the Ministry of Planning and Development, I have observed that we are a key liaison with the international and regional agencies, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, the European Union, and the United Nations. Failing to address the issue of sextortion not only damages us on a national level, but can damage us on an international level as well, and risk straining our relationship with vital partners.
The motion that we had to bring was regarding legislation, or asking the government to bring legislation within 12 months for sextortion. Some of the main points that would have been cited was the lack of current laws covering sextortion or new laws being needed to be implemented to address the issue. The main points that I think we looked at was the lack of data to support sextortion, the CSO not having the sufficient data to help us attack the matter. If we are to bring policy or we are to bring legislation, you would need the sufficient data in order to understand the communities that are affected the most, the age groups that are affected the most, and the industries that are affected the most.
Other participants in the YES Leadership Program also spoke about their time in the program, training and preparing to carry out their duties.
This experience was amazing. It was a bit overwhelming to know that you have such power within such an already powerful house. It was kind of daunting because you want to draw from examples that you've heard in the past, but at the same time you do know that you are working with new or unseasoned contributors and you don't want them to feel too daunted in their contributions. But overall the experience was great. I would definitely love to do it again if it does arise, but truly fulfilling experience, yes. This was a space and a way to bring so many young women from so many different backgrounds together, and especially exploring an issue such as sextortion. You really get a wide or wider overview of it doing the process like this. So I would definitely encourage them to have another cohort, and not just another cohort, but perhaps, to revamp the process to make it even more inclusive in the future. So I'm definitely on board with that.
It was just such a fantastic experience learning about the topic of sextortion, which was the topic of the debate. Prior to taking part in the program, I actually did not know about sextortion, so it was very informative for me. I had the benefit of learning from the esteemed Ms. Chantal LaRoche. So she gave me some pointers on the duties and responsibilities of the clerk, how to time speakers, what an order paper looks like, the procedure of Parliament, and of course the standing orders. So those are some of the things. As well, we also had the unique experience of having a 3-panel judge. 3 judges who educated us on the elements of sextortion. So that was a fantastic experience for me. I definitely would encourage young women to apply, because often it is felt that women are good enough to be educated professionals, but we're not good enough to be in positions of authority and in leadership positions. So they tell us, yes, we'll let you in the gates, but not completely. So I think that programs like these really encourage women to really take up leadership roles and give them the key education and skills that they need. So definitely.
My experience today was a remarkable one. It was truly exciting and a wonderful experience all around. The contributions of the ladies were astonishing to me. They were well researched and well thought out. Vibrant points of views were being shared, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Without a doubt, I think the program was a very beneficial one. It was truly a remarkable learning experience, and I think that the women or young girls of Trinidad and Tobago would benefit from this type of program.
Coming from Tobago, it was an experience. It was thoroughly enjoyed. The Saturday sessions were really good. Those that I could have attended, I did. For me, the most interesting part of this session was the leadership training done by Dr. Maria Dillon Remy. She gave us insightful tips, herself along with Mrs. Manning. That was the best session I would have had during this entire experience, because it allowed me to think more about how I could be a better leader, a better person overall. Coming from the first cohort, I definitely think that it is something that should be continued, giving young women, especially the exposure of parliamentary procedures, leadership, mentorship from the past and current parliamentarians. That was a really good experience, and I would like the opportunity for other young persons in this space to experience this.
Being in Parliament, the experience was nerve-wracking. I would say for me, and most of us experienced that, but it was a learning experience as well. The entire training program, we would have prepped for, getting into our roles, and then later on we were separated into groups, the opposition, me being the chief whip for the opposition and the government. So that gave us, that little competitive spirit, but we didn't want to lose sight of what we came to talk about, which was, understanding the need for the legislation and seeing the other young women express their points, seeing the other young women be so interested in the well-being of our country. It was very, very amazing, and I think it will be a lasting memory for us all. This program showed us that there are many young women who are interested in getting involved in things like this. I believe Ms. LaRoche would have expressed they had over 200 and something applications, and only 40 of us or so were selected. So that itself shows that there are young women who want to get involved, there are young women who want their voices to be heard, and this is the perfect opportunity to do so. So I'm thankful that I had the experience.
Certainly, without a doubt, it gives not only the opportunity for us to push the government to enact legislation on unsung topics. However, it gives young women the opportunity to prove to themselves and others that they are leaders in their own right, whether they are lawyers who are accustomed presenting or engineers, or we even had a mathematician, and she was able to stand and present like she was an attorney.
The Yes Leadership Program was a really enriching experience for me as a young woman who is in leadership, and I think that the program has significant benefits for any young woman who is interested in pursuing a career in politics or in leadership or decision making. I think the program had a quite well-organized format in terms of combining both theoretical as well as practical components for learning about things like leadership, community service, as well as political procedure. And so, of course, I would encourage any young woman who is interested in a career in politics to get into the Yes Leadership Program, because it really does equip you for political service. Well, I am an attorney by profession. I am a criminal defense attorney, so that the legal aspect of the training program was most fascinating for me. So perhaps one of the most interesting sessions for me was the session on sextortion, which is where we had High Court judges come in and actually go through the legal framework for sextortion with us. And almost immediately, I was like, I want to be the person laying the foundation for this bill, or for the introduction of the legislation, rather, because of course it is in line with what I do professionally. And so they had a selection process. I applied and I was selected to be the leader of the opposition, of course being the person responsible for opening as well as closing the actual parliamentary debate. Research encompassed a lot of reading because, of course, you know, participating in any kind of parliamentary debate requires you to do very rigorous research so that you understand both the pros and the cons of bringing a particular motion. I also watched Parliament Channel day in and day out just to become a little bit more familiar with the political procedure because, of course, as young women who are in leadership, we are not accustomed to parliamentary debates. And while as an attorney, I do work in litigation and advocacy, I was not used to the actual parliamentary debate process. So I had to watch Parliament Channel a lot just to get into the groove of how it was like to present motions and to respond. And so it was very hectic but very rewarding. I think that we did have an excellent debate. All young women were well prepared and did participate fully in the process.
After the sitting, the participants were treated to a reception at the Rotunda Gallery, where they were addressed by members of the Women Parliamentarians of Trinidad and Tobago and were presented with their certificates of participation. The Women Parliamentarians of Trinidad and Tobago is a cross-party group which was launched in March 2023. Its mission is to create a collaborative network to promote women's access, representation, and influence in Parliament and other political decision-making spaces. Stay tuned for further parliamentary updates. For more information, visit our website at www.ttparliament.org and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram.
Parliamentary updates.